Hey everybody, Mr. Wilson here. So I thought I would kind of do a demonstration here in section 7.2 where we're talking about integration by parts. And so importantly, if we're applying a situation where we're going to have to utilize integration by parts multiple times, turns out there is kind of a shortcut for it, but it's only going to work in certain nice cases. And so, depending on when you learned this, as most famously made in the 1988 movie Stand and Deliver, featuring Edward James Olmos as an inner city calculus teacher, the idea is that we have a technique known as Tic Tac Toe. So what's going on here? So we've got our function f of x g times g of x as usual. But what we know is that we have some information about this function. So we have that our function f is preferably a polynomial. Something such that as you're taking the derivatives, your function becomes simpler and simpler. And then g, your function g, is either a trig or a exponential kind of function. One where as you're taking the antiderivatives, it's not too complex, in terms of like basic sines or cosines, something like that. And so what's happening here? So what we're going to do then is, just like we normally would with our integration by parts technique, I'm going to be keeping track of my derivatives of f, my antiderivatives of g, my u and dv and v and du, all that stuff. So what is that going to look like? Well, I'll start off with just my regular f and g functions. Then below it, I'm going to go write my first derivative of f and my, first antiderivative of g. So I'll go ahead and just call that capital G. And then I'm going to keep repeating this process over and over again. So I'm going to just kind of use this notation as the antiderivative of capital G. I guess I could call it like GG or something, but whatever. But anyway, I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to keep taking a derivative for the function f on the left side, keep taking an antiderivative for my function g on the right side. And so what would actually happen is, if we were to run through our process of integration by parts, these are the terms that would naturally be appearing. And so what we want to do then is, as we've seen, we want to be multiplying these certain things together. It turns out, though, I'm not multiplying straight across. It turns out I actually look at my diagonals that I've got here. And so, fortunately, in our traditional setup, this is our function f would be our u term, and our capital G function would be our v term. But I'm going to keep working in that same pattern, looking at my diagonals of products of functions. And so I'm going to be multiplying those bits together, but then I want to be adding and subtracting them, accounting for the plus or minus signs that could appear. And so it turns out it alternates in order here, plus, minus, plus. And so I would keep running through this pattern. Eventually, if my function f is a nice polynomial, eventually its derivative will just go down to 0, and this process will stop. So let's look at an example of what that would look like in our situation here. So I'm going to take x squared cosine of, 4x dx. So again, I think we see here that our function f would be the x squared polynomial. Our g function, or the dv term, would involve our cosine function here. So I'm going to go ahead and write those separately. Then I want to start taking my antiderivatives and derivatives for each respective column. So of course, left side's easy for my derivatives. Now, of course, for the other side, doing antiderivatives, knowing our trig functions is quite helpful at this point. And then we would have to worry about something like chain rule substitution in this instance as well. So here minus 1/16, and then minus 1, again, chain rule here. Okay. I could keep going, but I notice here that I've got a derivative of 0, so that would just be 0 forever onward. So now I'm going to look at my products of terms here, and I'm going to be taking plus of the first product, the minus of the second product, the plus of the third product, and I would just keep repeating that pattern over and over again. So what I've got here now, I've got positive x squared times 1/4 sine of 4x minus 2x times negative 1/16 cosine of 4x. And then for the last piece here, plus 2 times negative 1 over 64th sine of 4x. And so, cleaning all this stuff up here, fortunately my fractions are pretty straightforward. So here, 2, negative 2, and negative 1/16 gets me positive 1/8. And then, of course, 2 times negative 1 over 64 is just minus 1 over 32. And as this was an indefinite integral, the very end, plus c. And so this is a situation where if we were to run through our traditional integration by parts setup, where our u term would be the polynomial, the dv term would be the trig function, we would have to run through this a couple of times, obviously, in order to come up with our antiderivative. Fortunately, this kind of technique, the Tic Tac Toe method, does help us get there a little bit faster, but obviously it's only going to work in very restrictive cases.